My name is Josh Arata, and I have the pleasure of serving as the chair for the Memorial Student Cinema Wiley Lecture Series for the 2017-2018 school year. The Wiley Lecture Series is a student-led committee within the Memorial Student Center, dedicated to enhancing the educational experience through thought-provoking discussion on national and foreign policy topics. I want to thank you for all joining us this evening for our program, Rapid Fire, Mass Shootings and the Second Amendment. Before I begin, I would like to mention that our third panelist, Mr. Art Acevedo of the Houston Police Department, was taken ill earlier today and will not be joining us. However, I have no doubt that our panel tonight will both be engaging and informative. Adrienne Rubenstein serves as the Director of Symposia within the Wiley Lecture Series and will be serving as tonight's moderator. She's a sophomore political science major from Houston, Texas.
Howdy.
Howdy.
My name is Adrienne Rubenstein, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Symposia for the Wiley Lecture Series. If this is your first time joining us, this is our final program of the semester. And I want to share that originally we had an entirely different program in mind. Titled Rapid Fire, intended to emphasize the nature of these tragedies, which are often followed by mass media coverage and promises for change from our leaders in Washington. Oftentimes, the coverage disappears in a matter of days, and with it, all resulting policy proposals. So when the Las Vegas massacre occurred, we at Wiley knew this was a discussion we needed to bring to campus. We are fortunate to be joined tonight by Ms. Jill Switzer and Alice Tripp. Jill Switzer is the Executive Director of Texas Gun Sense. Previously, she has worked as a civil rights investigator as well as at the Texas Department of Health on public health data analysis, strategic planning and policy development, rooted in public health principles. She has also served as public policy director at Mental Health America of Texas, where she worked on gun violence issues that often overlap with mental health issues. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Switzer to the podium.
Hi, everybody again. First of all, I have to tell you about my chin, because otherwise you'll be like, what is that on her chin? So, I'm from New Orleans, and I have a big family that mostly still there. Went to a wedding this weekend of my niece. Came home Sunday, it was a crazy weekend. Came home Sunday, threw my suitcase on the floor, went to get my husband his suitcase, and tripped on mine and landed on my chin. So it's a really nasty bruise. Could have been worse. My teeth are intact. So the first and most important thing I'll say is that I just started this job August 21st. So you'll hear me say a few times, like if you stump me, I'll say, well, you remember I'm new at this job. So I do have overlapping policy experience, 5 sessions I've worked with the legislature. So I wanted to thank Texas A&M and Adrienne specifically who contacted me. And I'm glad Alice is here, and I missed the chief because I'm from Austin and he was in Austin before he was in Houston. And I wanted to thank all of you for attending. I have a daughter who's a sophomore at Mary Hardin-Baylor, and so I know that college students could be somewhere else on a Thursday evening. So really glad you're here. So 2 things that, this kind of hokey, so I was going to say, please pull out your cell phones. 2 things I wanted to say. A lot of issues around gun violence, people may have had personal experience, and when you hear a lot about it, it can bring up those issues from the past. And so it can be hard. All of us have to remind each other to take a break when there's too much news coverage, when there's too much, you're just hearing too much about it. So one thing I was going to suggest is that it's the suicide prevention hotline, and it's not just about suicides. Anyone who's in crisis needs someone to talk to, etc. So I encourage you to look at the suicide prevention hotline. And I helped pass a bill that all public colleges, you're supposed to have information on your websites and at orientation about mental health issues and suicide prevention. So you know all of that already. And then the other thing, even when I got really familiar with mental health and substance use disorder issues, I always said I don't know a lot, but I know people who know a lot. So I invite you to email me. It's director@txgunsense.org. director@txgunsense.org. So here's some assumptions that are important to realize for my remarks. I always like to talk about evidence-based practices and the data that supports them. Another reason I gave you my email address is because in the time allotted, I can't give you all the statistics in the world, and then you might fall asleep and snore. So I invite you to email me and say, you said this, but I don't know if I think that's true. Where did you get that information? I always focus on good public policy, which means addressing the public interest, being effective and doable. And a lobbyist that when I first started working at the Capitol said, something you've always heard, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So we try for good policy. The mission statement for Texas Gun Sense, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, very nonprofit organization, is we advocate for evidence-based, common sense policies that reduce gun injuries and deaths. So we take that very seriously, common sense and evidence-based. We're not anti-gun, we're not anti-Second Amendment. And again, I invite you to look at our website, which is pretty good. And I can't take credit for that because, see, I already told you I was new. So here's some things that we need to do and think about going forward. You know, people have vigils after mass shootings or whatever it might be, and I'm always like, let's go. Let's get to the policy solutions. If there are some, let's all talk to each other on all sides of the issue and come up with something to make Texans safer. First, you can vote. I was going to say, who's registered to vote here? Who's eligible to be registered to vote? Okay. You can't complain unless you vote. One time when I was growing up, my brother's friend was talking politics, complaining about something. My mother said, "Are you registered to vote?" And he said, "No." And she said, "Well, leave and come back when you're registered." And she was serious. And so he did, so he could come lay on our sofa and eat our food. I don't like to focus just on mass shootings versus the homicides and suicides that happen literally every day in the United States, because here's a few reasons. Mass shootings are rare, and doesn't feel like it lately, but they are rare, which is another story. So I started August 21st. I'm new, did I tell you that? And my sister, when I went home for the wedding this weekend, she said, "Well, how do you like your new job?" And I said, "Oh, I really love my new job, but I just started, and then there's 2 mass shootings, right away." And she said, "Do they think it's your fault?" No, they don't think it's my fault. So anyway, mass shootings are rare. Actually, suicides are the most common death by firearm. Mass shooters tend to have a different demographic than folks who commit murders and folks who die by suicide. So mass shootings are not a good proxy for studying the overall issue of gun violence. I hope you heard me as I said, suicide is the highest, about 60% of firearm deaths are suicides. A lot of people don't realize that. And the biggest link I can make to policy there is safe storage, safe storage, safe storage. Maybe you don't know, but suicide is an impulsive act, and maybe from like 5 to 10 minutes from decision to death. And so it's very important that the means to suicide are kept safe. When folks are in distress, just those few minutes of unlocking a safely stored gun could mean the difference. Good news is that there's much consensus around the issues, a little more consensus coming out. Recently, Senator Cornyn filed a bill today, a bipartisan bill about background checks. I haven't read it yet, so don't ask me any hard questions. A poll came out yesterday saying 91% So 91% of the people agreed to a ban on, thought it was a good idea to have the ban on the sale of guns to people convicted of violent crimes, which would include domestic violence. 62% for stricter regulation of ammunition, 74% for a ban on gun modifications that can make the gun work like a fully automatic weapon. Here's some things that Texas statewide lawmakers can do. How's my time? Adrian, is my time okay? I have to tell more jokes. It's not a joking matter. I mean, it's like my mother always said, you have to laugh or cry, you know, and it's easier for me to go forward when I can keep a sense of humor about it. One gap in the law that you've heard about if you've been following these mass shootings is with folks convicted of domestic violence, that they're not allowed to buy weapons, but there's not a good follow-up on surrender of the weapons they already have. And so there does seem to be a lot of consensus around that issue. But it leads to the next issue, how do you define domestic violence versus other violent crimes? So a lot of folks think that you should also have, history of violence is the best predictor of future violence. So however you judge violence in the past and make a link to the possibility in the future, we might want to look at all of those who we restrict from having firearms as people with a violent past, not just domestic violence. Pass and populate the records for universal background checks. First of all, there are gaps in the background check system, and then, as we all know, the United States Armed Forces are not the only ones not populating the federal background check system. So Texas Gun Sense is very much in favor of a universal system, and then whatever it takes to make sure that folks are populating that system appropriately. Require a license to carry long guns. We have a license to carry for handguns. I'm putting things by the stars. One thing that, yeah, those are, some things are no-go, Alice, in Texas. Sorry, I didn't even put asterisks by them, the ones that I didn't think would work in Texas. That's another
You
thing.
only read the good one?
I only read the good ones. One thing that Adrian mentioned to me is when I was telling her at dinner that I'm new, she said, well, you know, you have a background in public health, and that's something I told the board when I was interviewed for my position, is that we don't need to be about blame, we don't need to be about anything but solving the issue. And if you read the, I think, fascinating articles about gun violence as a public health issue, you see that it works often just like a disease. And so we can bring to bear a lot of the public health, a systems approach, innovation. One thing that I'm a hardcore person on research, and we have a deficit around firearm research because I think it was like 20 years ago, a rider in the federal budget had the effect of telling the CDC not to do research on gun violence. And it kind of migrated over to the National Institutes for Mental Health as well. So I've seen these amazing little graphs that say, you know, we research Band-Aids more than we research gun violence. So Representative Villalba is a Republican in the Texas House, and he has been talking about having a commission to study the issues. That's smart in a lot of ways because the Texas legislature doesn't come back into session until 2019. And there are a lot of solutions that don't fit at Texas culture. And we need to make sure we examine the research that's out there and think of a way of filling that gap at the state and national level. And Adrian's getting on her chair. So I'm standing. Oops, your watch.
Ms. Alice Tripp has been the legislative director of the Texas State Rifle Association since 1998. That's when I was born, so it's quite a while.
She's killing it.
As TSRA's legislative lobbyist, she replaced longtime lobbyist Dr. James T. Brown. Her first session was 1999. Over the years, she's worked closely with the Texas legislature to support Second Amendment issues, including concealed handgun license, hunting, and general gun ownership. Her duties also include rating and endorsing candidates and incumbent legislatures and managing TSRA's Political Action Committee Fund. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Tripp.
I'm not new to anything. You get a bad score.
I get a bad score. She's the one who said she was born in 1998.
The Texas State Rifle Association's been around 99 years. I haven't, although some days it feels that way. We were, first of all, competitive shooters. And competitive shooters, that was important because it filled in for the military training. So it was mostly men. I have 36,000 and a half men, all telling me what to do. Doesn't work. So about 20 years ago, my predecessor hired me for a part-time job that has never been part-time. But you should know that the politics of the gun is only about 30 years old. And the Second Amendment is still alive and well. The reason for the Bill of Rights is that the U.S. Constitution, compared to other countries' constitutions, is very short. Very short. And it wasn't about to be ratified by the other states. And the Bill of Rights was marketing. Some of the states were very concerned. They didn't want any kind of central government. Oh no, we just got rid of one, thank you. They wanted no part of it. This was a buy-in. And the first two amendments to the Bill of Rights are the strongest, because nobody was going to give up the right to speak their piece. And nobody was going to give up the right to defend themselves. It wasn't hunting, for God's sakes. Well, I knew they needed to hunt a lot. It was personal protection. And it certainly was getting rid of a very onerous government. And by the way, they were rebels. You got to remember that. They were at war with their neighbors, who now live in Canada. The ones that weren't dealt with. And it wasn't a well-regulated militia. I know them. They were my ancestors. They came across the Cumberland Gap and took on Patrick Ferguson at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And it was cold, and it was rainy, and it was October. And the colonel was 35 years old. That's who won the battle. Those battles. You brought your neighbors, and occasionally you brought your spies. So your firearm that you have now, here we are in Texas, and I'm telling you, I don't think much has changed from that long ago era. Harris County, Houston, has 4.5 million people stuffed into that county. But Presidio County has 7,000 people. There's nobody there. You dial 911, they're going to be coming from the moon. And they're close to Mexico, which, by the way, has the most restrictive gun laws in our hemisphere. And as Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you? The only people in Mexico that have firearms without the permission from the country are the criminals. So when you talk about, well, they meant a well-regulated militia, not my ancestors. They weren't well-regulated. So, and by the way, one of them was the first governor of Kentucky, so we're talking about prominent people. You all are prominent people. So that's my thoughts on the Second Amendment. It's as important now and it's alive now, at least in this state, because Texas is a state of self-determination. That's what happens when you're a country first. You don't really give that up. You really, really don't. But remember, I've got a state rep who represents 24 counties. And in Harris County, there are 22 state reps. That's what population does. One state rep who does a flyover with a banner to campaign, and others who do yard signs. I also wanted to tell you that, like Ms. Switzer, I am first of all a forensic kind of person. When something happens, I want to know how come and why. I was hired in 1998 as the lobbyist, and before my first session, my 32-year-old son interrupted an armed robbery in a restaurant. It was just a sandwich place near the intersection of 183 and 620 in Austin. Now, he had a license to carry, but he wouldn't carry it. And the bad guy came in with a ski mask on, average white kid, and a revolver. Put them all on the floor. There were 3 in the restaurant waiting to get their sandwiches. And the guy that owned the restaurant slammed the cash register drawer and wouldn't give him any money. He kicked my son, broke a rib, stole his billfold. He didn't have any money in it. It was in a money clip. And he did the usual, anybody moves or tries to follow me, that stuff you hear in the movies. And he ran out the door. But Michael is my son, and he ran out the door behind him. It was November the 1st, and it was dark. But Mike saw the getaway car on Pecan Creek Parkway, and he jumped in his car and got behind it. When you all grow up and have daughters, if they loan their boyfriends their car, take it away from them forever. So Michael writes down the license plate number. He's behind. The passenger is the robber. The girlfriend, boyfriend, getaway car is the driver. And at the intersection of 620 and 183, Mike sees the robber pull off the ski mask, and he couldn't resist. Now he's got the license plate number. Smart boy. What he did next wasn't. He pulled up beside him. The passenger side robber gets out of the car as his friend is driving, sitting in the window, shoots across the windshield. It goes through Michael's arm, crosses his abdomen, and I get the phone call no mother ever wants. Fate's interested me. I just took a job as a gun lobbyist. Michael's okay. He had a year with a colostomy. But what really fueled me in my job was what happened next. It was on Travis County-Williamson County line. Travis County is extremely blue, if you know what I mean. Williamson County, at that point in time, we think they may have hung people, we're not sure. So it was extremely different politically. They catch the bad guy. He had stolen, and this is what I always do, he had stolen the .38 revolver. Revolver? Can't get much more simple a firearm. From a house he was working on remodeling. It had been reported stolen. This was his 3rd attempt at armed robbery. Never got a dime. So we got a stupid 18-year-old armed robber. I get a phone call after he was arrested from the victim services people from Travis County, Austin. wanting me to make a victim impact statement because Michael can't. And I said, I don't want to be rude. I really don't, but we're hoping it goes to Williamson County. And she said, oh no, I hear that every day. That's blood chilling. So, happy ending. Michael's okay. The idiot's doing 3 consecutive life sentences. Go team. Every single prohibition from firearms ownership, and the list is huge. Misdemeanor conviction of family violence. Misdemeanor. The Sutherland Springs guy had served a year in a military prison. He was prohibited from gun ownership or possession. He couldn't sit next to you in your deer blind. But the Air Force didn't report it into NICS. So, do we have a law? Dishonorable discharge, felony. If you renounced your citizenship, if you were an undocumented alien, on and adjudicated mentally ill, you gotta go through a court. Virginia Tech. That young man was arrested, he was a senior, he was arrested for stalking. He went to the courts, and the courts realized this guy had a severe anxiety disorder, and the court ordered him into treatment. His professors couldn't know they were sitting next to a time bomb. Oh no, Hippocratic oath, we can't do that. That would be unconscionable. And it wasn't reported into NICS. So, he goes and he purchased 2 common caliber handguns. Handguns, nothing special. A month apart, because heaven forbid, common sense legislation in Virginia was you can't buy one more than one a month. Then there's the Jean Cleary Act, which is federal law, that says if there's an active shooter on campus, you've got so much time for your law enforcement to give out that notice. Well, he starts in one side of the campus, hurts a bunch of people, and then he disappears. And law enforcement goes, oh, he's gone. Oh, good. So they didn't put out the active shooter notice. He'd gone to the other side of the campus and taken it up again. So, he'd been adjudicated mentally ill and ordered into treatment. He passed a NICS check twice without any problem. He bought 2 common caliber handguns. One was a .22 that you wouldn't even shoot a squirrel with, and he absolutely, it was devastating. Oh, gun month. Oh. I was just getting warmed up. I'm like a Baptist preacher on Sunday. I love what I do. When I took this job, I asked my husband, what if I find there's all kinds of public safety laws missing? I was married to the smartest man I've ever known. I'm a widow now. He laughed when I said that and said, let me know if you find anything. I found laws not prosecuted. I found laws that were on the books where they weren't done correctly, which Senator Cornyn's bill is to require all these branches of the military. You wouldn't think you'd have to do that. To report this stuff like the rest of our courts do. So if public safety, that's my kind of gun control. I never met a gun I didn't like. And I never heard of gun violence. Guns are inanimate objects. To assign them a human quality, like violence, is to believe in totemism, which is a form of magic.
It's a lame excuse.
God bless you, sir.
God bless you, ma'am.
I'm a gunitarian.
Fine.
And with that, we'll move on to our moderated discussion. Ms. Switzer, you mentioned, both of you, that Senator Cornyn built a bipartisan bill about background checks. So what sorts of characteristics might indicate that a person should not be in possession of a firearm? And what have policymakers and law enforcement officials identified that may have informed proposed policies regarding gun measures?
Uh-oh, I should have started writing. What sorts of characteristics?
Would indicate that a person should not be in possession of a firearm. In other words, what are we looking at when we're saying, okay, this means that it's more likely for someone, you know, to be a perpetrator in one of these events?
So, as I said earlier, a history of violence is the best predictor of violence in the future. And so folks, we've been hearing about the domestic violence issue, people who are violent in other ways besides a partner. And there are some circumstances in which people with mental illness, the current situation is if you've been adjudicated mentally ill, like put in a state hospital, what's the word I'm looking for?
Institutional? Institutional.
Yeah, required to be in an institution. Oh, I haven't had enough.
Committed.
Committed by the court, but committed by the court rather than your own self. There's evidence that shows that people with a history of DUI are more violent than the general population. There are things that we would look at to indicate a future of violence and consider whether that's a link that we want to make as far as restricting access to firearms. One of the pieces of legislation that Texas Gun Sense had last session was called the Lethal Violence Protective Order. Some states call it Extreme Violence Protective Order. And the interesting thing about that is it would get at folks who are suicidal and folks who might be homicidal. And it takes a judge's decision to temporarily suspend the ownership of that person's ability to get a weapon until they're at a better place. If you think of that in terms of suicidal folks, you don't want access to weapons. There's a board member of Texas Gun Sense who's, I can't tell the story, well obviously it wasn't my story, but I'm telling it because she tells her story, is that one of her sons had a serious mental illness, was stockpiling weapons at their house. He was over 18. She called repeatedly the police, they came out, they said there's nothing that they could do, didn't meet the existing criteria, etc. He ended up killing his dad, her husband, with a knife. He's currently in the state, he was innocent, not guilty by reason of insanity. But she saw that as an opportunity where if there were a lethal violence protective order, she could address those issues when the situation was there was nothing that she could do. There had not been a crime committed. I just kind of went all over the place from your question. What sorts of people shouldn't have a weapon?
Ms. Tripp, this is for you. Taking recent shooting events into consideration, during the Las Vegas shooting, 50 people were killed and hundreds more were injured in about 10 minutes. And in the more recent one in Sutherland Springs, 26 were killed. And the killer was neutralized by a civilian with a firearm.
18.
And so what does this indicate about the role and abilities of officers to respond at a moment's notice? Are civilians the best enforcers of their own security?
Well, like I said before, you're always going to be your own first responder. Where I live a mile off a gravel road. There's nobody going to come. But I don't care if you're in an apartment or you're in a crowd. When 9/11 happened, if you waited for somebody to tell you it was time to leave, Okay, it's your turn. You didn't make it. If you got up and took control, you did. I don't care if it's male or female. You're always going to be responsible for your neighbors. And we tend to not do that, but you'll do it appropriately. I still don't understand Las Vegas, except we had a wealthy person, very wealthy, who could pass any amount of background checks. Do you know what a bump stock is? It actuates, it takes the energy from the recoil and directs it to your finger. So instead of the energy going into your shoulder, it transfers the energy to your finger so that your finger goes faster. A machine gun, which is fully registered and will cost you $20,000, which he could have afforded. I can't, you can't. But a transferable machine gun, $20,000 a pop. So that, pull one trigger and you can shoot a whole bunch of bullets. So this was a type of rifle, one trigger pull per finger. But this bump stock was added on. Now, you can make a bump stock by hooking on your belt loop, holding it with a rubber band. So someone asked me, a reporter, was it very, very accurate? Was it a sniper rifle? He couldn't see what he was shooting. How he broke out 2 windows in a hotel. I'm looking at the whole thing. Did you hear something? You know, it just blows my mind. He managed to fix the door that goes to the fire escape, which is the internal stairs, wouldn't open. And he had cameras on the peephole. I don't know. Was he nuts? Let's say he was someone with desperate circumstances, but he had hookers and lost $16,000 the night before. I don't know if we've created these monsters, some of them. So I don't have a problem with any firearm. I don't even have a problem with any firearms add-on. I would like to tell you that the FBI has charts on their website, fbi.gov, that are called Murder by Weapon. And the latest chart is 2016. And rifle to pistol is 19-to-1 ratio. 19 more pistols commit murder than any kind of rifle. And then there's another category called other, because they didn't know what type of weapon. They just went bullet hole. And so if you did 19-to-1 with that category and added it to rifles, in a year, it was 700. The same number as stabbings are beating somebody to death with your fist. So while these rifle shootings are dramatic and horrible and huge, if you look at the whole thing, which is, having been there myself or close, it's actually gone down. What I want to see done, what we would be happy with, is a better use of the legal tools. It's a federal felony to attempt to buy a firearm if you're one of those prohibited classifications. And by the way, there's no accidental felons out there. I didn't know. You mean I was dishonorably discharged? Heaven forbid. But that's almost what happened with the guy in Sutherland Springs. He bought 4 guns, and nobody in the FBI who administers NICS sent him the equivalent of a traffic ticket, a federal felony. You don't have to have, we made a law, we put a felony in it, and look at all the people we stopped. Stopped? It's like telling don't make me have to get up to your 2-year-old, and you never get up. What kind of message does that send to criminals? They don't, you're a joke. It hurts law enforcement, it hurts us all. Am I through?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And then one more quick question before we open this up to the audience. This is for either one of you. Frequently with these mass shootings, we see one weapon in particular. So why has the AR-15 become the weapon of choice for mass shooters, and why is it also a common choice for everyday consumers?
You mean to take it?
Yes.
It's cheap. It's a cheap gun. I use it to shoot hogs. Me. 35 in 2 weeks, I'm good. I live on a farm. We do not give our military high-end firearms. Don't think that for a second. It's plastic and stamped metal. They're lightweight, so you can carry it around. But you're giving it, and excuse me again, to a kid. Don't lose this, would you not? It's cheap. President Obama sold more than anybody. And ammunition. And it was the fear of losing an important firearm. And we use it on the ranch. And competitive shooters use it. And it's cheap. But again, remember, the gun that's used in most crimes is a handgun. When I started lobbying 20 years ago, I was hearing the bad gun of the day. Oh, bad gun, sit, stay. Bad gun of the day wasn't a rifle. It was what they called a Saturday night special. And a Saturday night special was a cheap revolver. And I remember legislators coming to me going, why do we want to protect a Saturday night special? And I said, I'm poor. I have a handgun license. It's the only gun I can afford. And they went, oh yeah, that makes sense. And it didn't happen. To assign violence to an inanimate object and not punish the criminal when the punishment and the laws are in place, shame on you. Shame on you. You're a bad parent. So, other than that, nothing to say.
All right, well, I wish I was kidding, but I have pages of questions here, but I want to open this up to you. So if you'd like to ask a question, I'll take those now, and please tell me who you'd like them to be answered by. Yes?
I guess mine's going to be more towards Ms. Tripp instead of Ms. Switzer, but because of your involvement as a lobbyist since 1999, but are either two of you familiar with Project Exile?
Oh, quite.
How do you think that could be used?
Gun crime means hard time.
Yeah, correct. Is that a possible solution for
What he's talking about is a project that was done
in Richmond, Virginia?
in Richmond, Virginia that NRA supported. And here's what it included. If you committed a crime using a firearm, at that time this was handguns, you were going to be prosecuted by the federal law, which I'm telling you, there ain't no plea bargaining, which meant you were going to do jail time. And they put billboards in high crime areas, and it said, Project Exile. Gun crime means hard time, and exile was most federal prisons. I heard it said was so far your mama couldn't come see you. And we saw crime go way down. Because, again, penalty, punishment. Is that an answer?
Do you think it's a viable project that could be brought back?
Yeah, somebody's got to do it. But why would you expand something like background checks, universal, when it's full of holes and you're not, of the outrageous number of people that Nix has stopped for trying to purchase a firearm, some of which, and it's probably a small amount, were eligible, just caught up in it. How many do you think were prosecuted? Oh, like 150 in the world. So you've got this tool, you've got these penalties, you've got these prohibited people, you've got their name, address, and phone number. And you want to expand it to rifles? I don't think so. Or give a license, heaven forbid, to rifles. Or expand it so that if I give my grandson a gun, I'm going to do a background check on him. Not going to happen. Makes no sense.
Anyone else? Yes, Sarah.
I have a question. So I'm from the city of Chicago, which has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. But the thing is that if you look at the graphs, the guns are actually coming from surrounding Republican states like Indiana and Wisconsin. And so the problem isn't that our gun laws are so strict, the problem is that the states around us have very loose gun laws. And I was just wondering how either of you would respond to that.
Why would I want to go to Chicago with a gun?
I don't know.
The idea that people are going, let's get a gun and take it to Chicago. I've heard this before, and the idea of people around them having less and they're sending them all, but the people around them don't have that crime. So it's like, let's get a gun and run to Chicago and commit a crime. How's that sound?
Well, we have crime because we've destroyed our neighborhoods due to the war on drugs. But so the social situation has vastly contributed, and the people who want the guns are probably going out and getting them and bringing them back. Nobody's delivering them from another state. how would you respond to that, I guess?
Okay, I'm going to set this on Adrian's head.
Okay.
Well, I have read the studies that the guns come from other surrounding areas. And I would have to agree, you know, a public health approach to, let's call it gun-related violence, would say, what are the causative factors? And I agree with you that the breakdown of communities has a spiraling effect on poverty, on education, on employment, and on violence. And so I don't think that's an excuse for the surrounding areas having laxer gun laws that are trafficked into Chicago. It's not only one issue to solve any one problem. There's not a magic situation or solution. And then I'm going to go off question and say, I agree so much with what Alice says about the background check system we have in place and how we need to populate it and make sure it's enforced, and when people violate the provisions of it, that we need to punish those folks. But not all gun sales are subject to background checks. And that's the gap, is that once we populate the systems, which in some cases will take laws and regulations, in some it's just do what you're supposed to do, armed forces. But there are many situations that don't involve a gun background check. So if we're all on board with background checks, then let's make it a universal situation.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, I don't know. When you started to make the play with words, I'm sorry if I found that kind of lame. I just don't understand. I'm talking to Ms. Tripp on this point, because I do probably owe you some sort of like respect for what you try to do to make the world a little bit better. You know, I mean, granted, the militias, yeah, we need them in the revolutionary times. You know, that was the last thing we were going to do, is let the tyranny continue, and we had to, you know, defend ourselves. and maybe we had to defend ourselves against, you know, criminal types in our lives. You know, it just seems that whole thing has been exploded into some kind of sense of, I don't understand it sometimes. And that's why the play with guns, about guns don't commit crime, people do, and guns, you know, people don't die from, you know, guns, you know, bullets do. And I mean, it's like, it gets to be not funny anymore. Or
Not meant to be.
not serious. No, it doesn't address the real issue.
Which
That's what I'm
is?
saying, which is the lethality of that thing. And you mentioned something about a $20,000 machine gun.
Mhm.
I don't even think that's legal, and I may be wrong on that, but I'm sure that anyone who
It
wants
is.
a bazooka can get a bazooka. Anyone who wants to get an arm thing to launch a rocket could get it. I mean, they're out there on the market. They don't do background checks on terrorists.
No, but they do on machine guns.
Thankfully, you know, and you know, who needs a machine gun anyway? I don't understand even why hunting hogs with a machine gun is somehow justifiable, so let's give it to everyone.
That way, yes.
But, you know, I don't understand it, so I don't like the playing around with something that's so deadly, and it causes...
I'm sorry,
How many
sir.
guns are there in this
Sir, I'm
country?
sorry you
How many guns are there in this
misunderstood.
country? How many guns are there?
300 million, roughly.
Yeah, there's one for everyone. Every baby, child, you know,
Yeah.
criminal, everything. I mean, it just seems like the accessibility of guns is something that might be the problem. That might be the problem, that they're so frequently passed around. And the fact that we do have some guns that aren't luckily safely locked up. Someone walks in, oh, gee, you know, this house is empty. I think I'll grab it for my next crime. That's what I mean, the accessibility. It sort of like slips into our means of a solution. I'm mad at my mother-in-law. Yeah, I think I'll use my hunting rifle. I think I'll use my gun. I think I'll use a knife. That whole violent attitude seems to creep into solution making and not the public health. So I guess that's kind of what I'm glad the Second Amendment's there, but I don't know if it's utilized the way it was meant to be. I think it's used as a business model. Because I think the only people that are making money off this, I guess I'm making a statement more than I'm asking a question.
A question for
I'm
Mr.
sorry,
Tripp.
but there's a lot of economics behind this, not only just profit,
Any other
but profit.
questions?
So,
You?
Excuse me.
I guess that was my main question, was like, you know, how many of those 300 million weapons become stolen weapons and get involved in crimes, and the poor police have to like do this. So, I'm just at a loss on what to do from here. I hope we come up with some collaborative ideas instead of political playing with people's lives. I mean, how many people here have been touched by gun violence? Violence by guns, or died from a bullet, you know? I mean, this is the stuff we should be talking
Sir,
about.
I'd like to thank you for your contributions. I think we can all agree at one sitting here that this topic is very sensitive and it touches a
Yes.
lot of us here. But for that reason, I'd like to continue the conversation with other members of our audience who might also
Right.
have that conversation. Sir, I respect your opinions, and I'm glad we were able to come here, but I'd like to extend the rest of the questions to the audience that they may also ask questions for our distinguished panelists. If that's
Right.
okay with you, sir.
All right. Would anyone like to comment on what I just said? Is there any sense to what I'm rambling about?
Do you have a question?
I did have a question.
That was a question to the panel, what they thought about my opinions.
Both of you can answer this actually, because I think you both will have strong opinions about this. He did bring a good point about accessibility and how, as you said earlier, the kid was able to get a gun in a house abandoned. Should we have a way of implementing guns into our education so our citizens can be more aware of, you know, the safeties and how accessible guns are?
I think back to the public health approach, a big part of a public health approach is education. And if you think of past public health interventions that have been extremely successful, seatbelts, tobacco use, vaccinations, a huge part of those successes were public education. You learned in school, you learned in your community, people talked about the issues. And I agree with one thing you were saying, is it can become diametrical, that that we have to pick one side or the other. And that's not, you know, the public health model is you keep trying and you keep trying and you keep trying to get it right. One thing I wanted to say about lethality is it's relevant when you think of it in terms of suicide. Middle-aged white men are the most, have the highest rate of suicide in this country. And that's because they most often use firearms. There are other demographics that attempt suicide more frequently, but completed suicides are in that demographic, and it's because of the overwhelming choice of firearms. So we're back to gun safety and responsible gun ownership. Texas does not have a requirement that you report stolen guns. Most of the responsible gun owners I know would do that. And by the way, to get your insurance payment for them, you better do that. But you know, that's just another example of how things can fall through the cracks. And I don't know, I lost track of your question. Tell me again.
Child safety.
Implementing education of guns.
Yes, I used to, one thing that in my previous job with Mental Health America, we had a big symposium every year with the Texas Suicide Prevention Council, 950 attendees, etc. And the swag that you got to take away was a gun lock. And so to me, that's marrying, you know, what do you care about? We're not anti-gun, we're about gun safety. And no, the public health model would say every injury is preventable. So we always have to aim for zero, and how do we get from here to there? Not only educating the kids, but you know, I am a mother, so I try not to judge other parents. But I will have to say, when Alice said, you're an irresponsible parent, sometimes that's what I feel like yelling, that you didn't do it right. You know, you left your gun where it shouldn't be, your kid's been injured by that, they injured their friend. That's an issue of parenting. And maybe sometimes it's an issue of education of that parent and that child.
And Ms. Tripp's organization even started out with education programs for
Still
people
do.
that have
And
guns.
the striped scarf.
Yes, I'm sure both of y'all are aware, Governor Abbott signed into law over the summer, open carry of all types of blades, swords, that sort of thing, and that's going to be implemented. It might already be in place right now, but how do you think that plays into the conversation of gun safety, the fact that people can now carry any type of knife, sword, axe, anything they want on a school campus in Texas or out in public?
Oh, look at me.
I do guns. Believe it or not, it's a big difference. And I'm not being facetious. I don't know what my bill. I don't disagree with it. It started out with the Bowie knife, Texas sugar, and the next thing I knew, they took the whole section, and I went, swords? It was two liberal Democrats that removed switchblades. And I kind of understood maybe it was their constituency, I don't know. But it was implemented September the 1st, it hadn't been a problem. Now, does that mean I haven't, even these guys aren't running around with swords? The idea that if you saw somebody with a sword walking down the street, a police officer couldn't stop them, that is just crazy. It's like, wow, nice sword, can I look at it? I don't know.
Can I just say
Yes.
one thing, at that other school in Austin, that other big university in Austin. Oh, stop it. The bill was under consideration when the gentleman with a serious mental illness attacked people on the UT campus with a machete. And I thought, maybe this is not a good idea. But, yeah, but we do guns.
I wish I could take all of your questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. I want to thank you all for spending your Thursday evening with us, and with that I invite our chair, Joshua Rada, back up to the podium.
Thank you again to our wonderful panelists for joining us this evening to host such a lovely conversation, as well as sharing their knowledge and their experiences with us. Tell us what you thought about our program tonight by completing the survey sheet that was included in your program booklet and drop it off at the table where you checked in on your way out. We would like to welcome you to follow us on social media in order to stay up with our upcoming programs in this spring semester. Thank you and have a good evening.